Hello traveller, and welcome to Medieval Screen Finds. Tonight, we go on yet another journey into the quiet corners of history. As the world outside settles into slumber, we will gently explore a fascinating, yet often overlooked aspect of the medieval world. The profound and often devastating consequences when a powerful lord, a figure of authority and wealth, found themselves utterly bereft of funds. Imagine, if you will, a time when power was not measured in Bitcoin, digital currencies or vast stock portfolios, but in acres of land, the strength of your castle walls, and the loyalty of your sworn vassals. In such a world, the stability of an entire region, the well-being of thousands, often rested on the financial solvency of a single individual, the lord of the manor, the baron, the count, or the duke. But what happened when this seemingly unshakable foundation began to crumble? What became of a medieval lord when their coffers ran dry? When their carefully constructed world of feudal obligations and inherited grandeur began to collapse under the weight of debt? Tonight, we will peel back the layers of medieval society, moving slowly and deliberately to understand not just the personal tragedy of such a downfall, but the far-reaching ripple effects that echoed through every stratum of medieval life, from the highest court to the humblest peasant's hut. We will trace the subtle signs of impending ruin, the desperate measures taken, and the quiet yet inexorable stripping away of power, prestige, and indeed, identity. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to get more boring sleep videos, but only if it brings you rest. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's comforting seeing all the places where these quiet stories reach. Imagine a vast estate sprawling across valleys and hills, dotted with villages, forests, and winding rivers. At its heart stands a formidable castle, its stone walls bearing witness to generations of power and prosperity. This is the domain of a medieval lord, a figure whose very existence is intertwined with the land and the people who toil upon it. Their wealth, their influence, their very identity flows from this connection. Yet, even the most powerful lords were susceptible to forces that could erode their fortunes, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum until their world began to unravel. The seeds of financial ruin were often sown in the very fabric of medieval life, lurking within the most fundamental aspects of their existence. One of the most voracious consumers of a medieval lord's wealth was, without doubt, warfare and military expenses. In an age defined by shifting allegiances, territorial disputes, and the constant threat of invasion, a lord's ability to wage war, or indeed to defend against it, was paramount. This was not a matter of choice. It was a fundamental aspect of their role, a core obligation of their feudal contract. But this necessity came at a staggering, often unpredictable cost. Consider the act of raising an army. A lord could call upon their vassals for military service, but this was rarely enough for a sustained campaign. They needed mercenaries, professional soldiers whose loyalty was bought with coin. These were not cheap. A well-trained knight, fully armoured, with their retinue of squires and men-at-arms, demanded significant payment. A company of archers or spearmen, though less costly individually, quickly added up when numbering in the hundreds or thousands. And the longer a campaign stretched, the deeper the financial drain. Provisions for these armies, food, water, fodder for horses, barrels of ale, had to be sourced, transported, and paid for, often in silver or gold. Weapons and armor needed to be forged, repaired, and replaced. The logistical nightmare alone was a constant drain, but the financial burden was truly crushing. Sieges, those prolonged, grinding contests of attrition against fortified strongholds, were perhaps the most ruinous. a siege could last for months, even years, immobilizing a lord's forces and consuming vast resources. Imagine the immense effort and expense: the construction of siege engines, towering trebuchets, massive battering rams, intricate siege towers, all requiring skilled carpenters, vast quantities of timber, and considerable labor. Provisions for the besieging army had to be maintained for the entire duration, and the constant vigilance, the slow grind of daily operations, bled a lord's treasury dry. Even if successful, the costs of repairing the captured fortifications, restocking garrisons, and governing the new territory added to the burden. And then there was the ever-present threat of capture and ransom. A noble, particularly a lord of high standing, was a valuable prize. If captured in battle or during a skirmish, their life was often spared, not out of mercy, but out of financial calculation. The captor would demand a ransom, a sum of money often so exorbitant that it could cripple the captured lord's family and estate for generations. Imagine the desperate negotiations, the frantic selling of jewels, the mortgaging of lands, the pleading with other nobles or even the crown for assistance, all to secure the release of their lord. The financial implications of a failed campaign, or even a successful one with heavy casualties, could thus extend far beyond the immediate battlefield, reaching into the very heart of the lord's financial stability. Prolonged conflicts stretching over years became bottomless pits into which even the wealthiest coffers could disappear, leaving behind only the cold ashes of ambition. Beyond the exigencies of war, another relentless pressure on a lord's finances was the almost insurmountable expectation of ostentatious spending and social pressure. In the medieval world, a lord's lavish lifestyle was not merely a matter of personal preference or comfort. It was a crucial, deeply ingrained aspect of their power, prestige, and legitimacy. To be a lord was to be seen as wealthy, generous, and powerful. To fail in this visual demonstration was to invite questions, doubt, and ultimately, a challenge to their authority. Consider the grand feasts. These were not simply meals. They were elaborate spectacles, carefully orchestrated performances designed to impress and bind. Weeks of preparation might go into a single feast. Vast quantities of meat, poultry, fish, bread, and ale, procured from across the estate and beyond. Skilled cooks, musicians, jesters, and servants all had to be paid. The sheer volume of food and drink consumed, the elaborate table settings, the entertainment, all served to reinforce the lord's generosity and status. To skimp on a feast was to appear weak, to risk losing the respect of your vassals and guests. Elaborate clothing was another non-negotiable expense. A lord and their family were expected to dress in garments made from the finest fabrics, silks, velvets, and brocades, often imported from distant lands. These were dyed in vibrant, expensive colors and adorned with furs, embroidery, and jewels. Such attire was a visual declaration of wealth and power, a constant reminder of their elevated position. And then there were the magnificent castles. While fortifications were essential for defense, their construction and maintenance often went far beyond mere practicality. Towers were made taller, halls grander, chapels more intricately adorned, all to showcase the lord's wealth and architectural prowess. Building a new wing, refurbishing a great hall, or even simply maintaining the existing structure against the ravages of time and weather demanded constant investment in skilled masons, carpenters, and labourers, as well as vast quantities of stone, timber, and other materials. Beyond the castle walls, the lord's life revolved around demonstrations of wealth. Hunting parties, elaborate affairs requiring trained falcons, hunting dogs, horses, and a retinue of attendants were both a sport and a social ritual, a chance to display prowess and entertain important guests. Tournaments, glittering spectacles of chivalry and martial skill, were incredibly expensive to host, requiring the construction of lists, prizes for the victors, and accommodation for numerous visiting knights and nobles. Each of these activities was not just leisure, it was a political necessity, a public affirmation of their status and ability to command resources. Finally, the patronage of arts and the church added another layer of financial obligation. Lords were expected to commission illuminated manuscripts, tapestries, sculptures, and works of art to adorn their castles and chapels. They were also significant benefactors of the church, donating lands, building chapels, endowing monasteries, and funding religious services. Such patronage was seen as a path to spiritual salvation, but also a profound display of piety and influence, further cementing their standing in both the earthly and divine realms. All these expenditures, though seemingly elective, were in fact deeply woven into the fabric of medieval noble life, exerting a relentless, often unsustainable pressure on their finances. Underpinning all of these grand expenses was the fundamental, yet often precarious, reality of poor economic management and agricultural dependence. Unlike modern economies with diverse income streams, a medieval lord's wealth was almost entirely derived from their land. Their income was intrinsically linked to the productivity of their estates, the success of their harvests, and the health of their livestock. This made them incredibly vulnerable to the whims of nature and the cycles of rural life. Underpinning all of these grand expenses was the fundamental yet often precarious reality of poor economic management and agricultural dependence. Unlike modern economies with diverse income streams, a medieval lord's wealth was almost entirely derived from their land. Their income was intrinsically linked to the productivity of their estates, the success of their harvests, and the health of their livestock. This made them incredibly vulnerable to the whims of nature and the cycles of rural life. Bad harvests were a recurrent nightmare. A prolonged drought could shrivel crops in the fields, leaving little to gather. Excessive rain could waterlog the land, rotting grains before they matured. Hailstorms could flatten entire fields in minutes, and early frosts could destroy what remained. Any of these natural calamities could drastically reduce the lord's income, as the peasants, themselves struggling, would have less to pay in rents, taxes, or produce. A series of poor harvests could be utterly ruinous, especially if combined with other pressures. Livestock epidemics were equally devastating. A sudden outbreak of plague among cattle, sheep, or pigs could wipe out a significant portion of a lord's animal wealth and severely impact the agricultural productivity of their manors. Less meat meant less food for the lord's household and less to sell or trade. Fewer draft animals meant less land could be ploughed and cultivated, further reducing future yields. The stench of diseased animals, the quiet desolation of empty pastures, spoke volumes of the economic disaster unfolding. Furthermore, a decline in population, whether due to famine, plague, like the Black Death, which profoundly reshaped European society, or prolonged warfare, directly impacted a lord's income. Fewer peasants meant less labour to work the fields, fewer tenants to pay rent, and a shrinking tax base. Lands could lie fallow, forests could reclaim fields, and the once bustling villages could become quiet, desolate places. The basic economic engine of the estate simply ceased to function efficiently. Overtaxation, paradoxically, could also lead to ruin. While a lord might be tempted to squeeze more revenue from their existing lands to cover mounting debts, pushing their peasants too hard could backfire spectacularly. Peasants, burdened by excessive demands, might simply flee the land in search of better conditions elsewhere. This act, though difficult and dangerous for the peasant, effectively removed them from the lord's tax rolls and labour pool, further diminishing the estate's productivity and income. the flight of even a few families could represent a significant loss. The flight of many could lead to widespread depopulation and the collapse of a manor's economic viability. Finally, unwise investments in ventures with no immediate return could also drain coffers. While some lords might invest in mills or improve their lands, others might pour money into speculative ventures, perhaps distant trading expeditions that never returned, or attempts to exploit unproven mineral deposits. Without a clear understanding of market forces or a robust system of financial assessment, such investments often amounted to little more than throwing good money after bad, diverting precious resources from immediate needs and productive uses. The direct link between the agricultural output of the land and the lord's income meant that any disruption to the former had immediate and severe consequences for the latter. Another significant, though often overlooked, financial drain was the intricate world of dowries and marriage settlements. For medieval noble families, marriage was rarely a matter of personal affection. It was a crucial strategic alliance, a means to consolidate power, expand influence, or secure peace. However, these advantageous unions came at a hefty financial price, often representing a significant drain on a lord's liquid assets, or landed wealth. When a lord had daughters, they were expected to provide a dowry, a substantial sum of money, goods, or even land given to the groom upon marriage. This dowry was intended to provide for the daughter in her new household, assert her family's wealth, and compensate the groom's family for taking her on. The size of the dowry was a direct reflection of the bride's family's status and bargaining power. For a lord with multiple daughters, the cumulative cost of dowries could be astronomical, requiring the sale of valuable assets, the mortgaging of lands, or the accumulation of significant debt. Imagine the pressure to provide a dowry grand enough to secure a favorable match for a beloved daughter, knowing full well it could strain the family's finances to their breaking point. Conversely, when a lord sought to purchase an advantageous marriage for a son, they often had to pay a substantial sum or offer significant concessions in terms of land or future income to the bride's family. This was effectively buying into a powerful lineage, securing an alliance, or gaining access to valuable territory. The negotiations were complex, often involving intricate calculations of lineage, land value, and political influence. While such marriages promised future benefits, they often tied up vast amounts of capital or required the alienation of valuable land, leaving the lord's immediate finances severely depleted. These transactions were less about immediate profit and more about long-term dynastic security, yet they could create immediate and crippling financial burdens, acting as a quiet, insidious drain on a lord's resources. Finally, a pervasive issue that magnified all these financial pressures was the almost complete lack of centralized finance and accounting. Unlike the meticulous ledgers and sophisticated banking systems of the modern world, medieval financial practices were often rudimentary, ad hoc, and highly personal. There were no double-entry bookkeeping systems, no standardized auditing procedures, and often no clear distinction between the lord's personal wealth and the income of their estate. Financial agreements were frequently based on oral agreements and personal relationships, sealed with handshakes or solemn oaths rather than complex contracts. While such systems worked in a small, tightly knit community, they were utterly inadequate for managing the complex finances of a large noble estate. It was incredibly difficult for a lord to accurately track their income, expenditure, and existing debts. Money might come in from various manners, be spent on different needs, and flow out to various creditors, all without a clear, consolidated overview. Imagine a lord relying on the memory of their steward or the scrawled notes on a parchment to understand their financial standing. Without a comprehensive system, it was easy for funds to be mismanaged, for debts to accumulate unnoticed, or for resources to be squandered without a clear understanding of the broader financial picture. This absence of systematic financial management meant that problems often festered, quietly growing in severity until they erupted into an undeniable crisis. It was a world where intuition and personal trust often stood in for rigorous financial analysis, making it incredibly difficult for a lord to prevent the slow, insidious drain of their wealth, even if they had the best intentions. These, then, were the quiet currents that could erode the foundations of a medieval lord's prosperity, leading them, almost imperceptibly at first, towards the precipice of ruin. Underpinning all of these grand expenses was the fundamental yet often precarious reality of poor economic management and agricultural dependence. Unlike modern economies with diverse income streams, a medieval lord's wealth was almost entirely derived from their land. Their income was intrinsically linked to the productivity of their estates, the success of their harvests, and the health of their livestock. This made them incredibly vulnerable to the whims of nature and the cycles of rural life. Bad harvests were a recurrent nightmare. A prolonged drought could shrivel crops in the fields, leaving little to gather. Excessive rain could waterlog the land, rotting grains before they matured. Hailstorms could flatten entire fields in minutes, and early frosts could destroy what remained. Any of these natural calamities could drastically reduce the lord's income, as the peasants, themselves struggling, would have less to pay in rents, taxes, or produce. A series of poor harvests could be utterly ruinous, especially if combined with other pressures. Livestock epidemics were equally devastating. A sudden outbreak of plague among cattle, sheep, or pigs could wipe out a significant portion of a lord's animal wealth and severely impact the agricultural productivity of their manors. Less meat meant less food for the lord's household and less to sell or trade. Fewer draft animals meant less land could be ploughed and cultivated, further reducing future yields. The stench of diseased animals, the quiet desolation of empty pastures, spoke volumes of the economic disaster unfolding. Furthermore, a decline in population, whether due to famine, plague, like the Black Death, which profoundly reshaped European society, or prolonged warfare, directly impacted a lord's income. Fewer peasants meant less labour to work the fields, fewer tenants to pay rent, and a shrinking tax base. Lands could lie fallow, forests could reclaim fields, and the once bustling villages could become quiet, desolate places. The basic economic engine of the estate simply ceased to function efficiently. Overtaxation, paradoxically, could also lead to ruin. While a lord might be tempted to squeeze more revenue from their existing lands to cover mounting debts, pushing their peasants too hard could backfire spectacularly. Peasants, burdened by excessive demands, might simply flee the land in search of better conditions elsewhere. This act, though difficult and dangerous for the peasant, effectively removed them from the lord's tax rolls and labour pool, further diminishing the estate's productivity and income. The flight of even a few families could represent a significant loss. The flight of many could lead to widespread depopulation and the collapse of a manor's economic viability. Finally, unwise investments in ventures with no immediate return could also drain coffers. While some lords might invest in mills or improve their lands, others might pour money into speculative ventures, perhaps distant trading expeditions that never returned, or attempts to exploit unproven mineral deposits. Without a clear understanding of market forces or a robust system of financial assessment, such investments often amounted to little more than throwing good money after bad, diverting precious resources from immediate needs and productive uses. The direct link between the agricultural output of the land and the lord's income meant that any disruption to the former had immediate and severe consequences for the latter. Another significant, though often overlooked financial drain was the intricate world of dowries and marriage settlements. For medieval noble families, marriage was rarely a matter of personal affection. It was a crucial strategic alliance, a means to consolidate power, expand influence, or secure peace. However, these advantageous unions came at a hefty financial price, often representing a significant drain on a lord's liquid assets, or landed wealth. When a lord had daughters, they were expected to provide a dowry, a substantial sum of money, goods, or even land given to the groom upon marriage. This dowry was intended to provide for the daughter in her new household, assert her family's wealth, and compensate the groom's family for taking her on. The size of the dowry was a direct reflection of the bride's family's status and bargaining power. For a lord with multiple daughters, the cumulative cost of dowries could be astronomical, requiring the sale of valuable assets, the mortgaging of lands, or the accumulation of significant debt. Imagine the pressure to provide a dowry grand enough to secure a favourable match for a beloved daughter, knowing full well it could strain the family's finances to their breaking point. Conversely, when a lord sought to purchase an advantageous marriage for a son, they often had to pay a substantial sum or offer significant concessions in terms of land or future income to the bride's family. This was effectively buying into a powerful lineage, securing an alliance, or gaining access to valuable territory. The negotiations were complex, often involving intricate calculations of lineage, land value, and political influence. While such marriages promised future benefits, they often tied up vast amounts of capital or required the alienation of valuable land, leaving the lord's immediate finances severely depleted. These transactions were less about immediate profit and more about long-term dynastic security, yet they could create immediate and crippling financial burdens, acting as a quiet, insidious drain on a lord's resources. Finally, a pervasive issue that magnified all these financial pressures was the almost complete lack of centralized finance and accounting. Unlike the meticulous ledgers and sophisticated banking systems of the modern world, medieval financial practices were often rudimentary, ad hoc, and highly personal. There were no double-entry bookkeeping systems, no standardized auditing procedures, and often no clear distinction between the lord's personal wealth and the income of their estate. Financial agreements were frequently based on oral agreements and personal relationships, sealed with handshakes or solemn oaths rather than complex contracts. While such systems worked in a small, tightly knit community, they were utterly inadequate for managing the complex finances of a large noble estate. It was incredibly difficult for a lord to accurately track their income, expenditure, and existing debts. Money might come in from various manners, be spent on different needs, and flow out to various creditors, all without a clear, consolidated overview. Imagine a lord relying on the memory of their steward or the scrawled notes on a parchment to understand their financial standing. Without a comprehensive system, it was easy for funds to be mismanaged, for debts to accumulate unnoticed, or for resources to be squandered without a clear understanding of the broader financial picture. This absence of systematic financial management meant that problems often festered, quietly growing in severity until they erupted into an undeniable crisis. It was a world where intuition and personal trust often stood in for rigorous financial analysis, making it incredibly difficult for a lord to prevent the slow, insidious drain of their wealth, even if they had the best intentions. These, then, were the quiet currents that could erode the foundations of a medieval lord's prosperity, leading them, almost imperceptibly at first, towards the precipice of ruin. However, their services also came with steep costs, disguised through various legal fictions to circumvent usury laws, such as currency exchange fees or gifts that effectively functioned as interest. Wealthy merchants within a lord's own realm might also serve as sources of loans, particularly if the lord held some power over their trade routes or markets. These loans might be secured against future goods or services. Even other nobles or powerful monastic orders could be lenders, though such transactions often came with political strings, attached or involved the pledging of specific assets, rather than a straightforward cash loan. The terms of these loans, regardless of the source, were often crippling. Crippling interest rates, whether explicit or disguised, meant that the debt could balloon rapidly, turning a temporary shortfall into an insurmountable burden. A loan taken in desperation could quickly become a financial millstone, dragging the lord deeper into the mire. As debt mounted, a lord would invariably be forced to begin pledging assets as collateral. This was the slow, painful process of mortgaging their future, piece by agonizing piece. Initially, a lord might offer up something easily reclaimable, or something whose value was high, but whose absence didn't immediately disrupt the daily functioning of their estate. Future harvest yields were a common early pledge. A lord might agree to sell the rights to a certain percentage of their grain, wine, or wool harvest to a creditor for a lump sum up front. This provided immediate cash, but it meant sacrificing future income, making the next year's budget even tighter and prolonging the cycle of debt. Imagine signing away the very bounty of the earth, knowing that the fruits of your peasants' labor would go not to your coffers, but to a distant moneylender. More valuable and tangible assets might follow: jewels, intricately crafted gold and silver plate, ornate chalices, or finely wrought weapons. These were portable and held intrinsic value, making them attractive to creditors. Each piece given up represented a quiet diminution of the lord's visible wealth, a subtle chip away at the outward display of their status. The absence of a family heirloom from the feasting hall, or the quiet disappearance of a cherished ring, might signal to observant courtiers that something was amiss. Eventually, if the financial tide did not turn, a lord might be forced to pledge segments of their land, or even entire manors. This was a far more serious step, as land was the ultimate source of a lord's power and income. Pledging land might mean granting a creditor the right to collect rents and revenues from a specific village or manor for a set period, or until the debt was repaid. In essence, the lord temporarily lost control and income from a portion of their domain. This wasn't merely a financial transaction, it was a weakening of their territorial base, a fracturing of their authority. The quiet shame of having a moneylender's agent collecting taxes from your peasants, knowing that revenue once yours was now flowing into another's coffers, must have been immense. Beyond merely pledging existing assets, a lord in deepening financial distress would almost certainly attempt to squeeze more revenue from their most direct source of income, their vassals and peasants. This meant increased taxation and demands. The feudal system, while providing reciprocal obligations, was ultimately built on the lord's right to extract resources from their lands and subjects. When times were flush, demands might be lighter. When the treasury was empty, the burden inevitably shifted downwards. A lord might implement increased taxes on their peasants, demanding more coin or more produce than was customary. These might be justified as necessary for the defense of the realm, for the upkeep of the castle, or for the lord's own increasingly dire personal needs. They might also levy special aids, extraordinary taxes, for specific events like a knight's knighting, a daughter's marriage, or the ransom of a captured lord. While these aids were theoretically limited, a desperate lord might invent new pretexts or demand them with greater frequency. Beyond direct taxes, the lord might demand more labor service from their serfs. Peasants might be required to spend more days working the lord's domain fields, repairing roads, or performing other tasks, diverting their precious time and energy away from cultivating their own plots. This additional labor meant less time for their own families and less produce to sell, increasing their own hardship and resentment. In some cases, a lord might also resort to selling off local offices or rights within their domain for quick cash. Imagine the lucrative position of a village reeve, a local judge, or the right to hold a market or fair in a particular town. These were sources of power, prestige, and often personal income for the office holder. A desperate lord might offer these positions for sale to the highest bidder, whether a wealthy commoner or a lesser noble, undermining their own long-term administrative authority for an immediate influx of funds. This was a dangerous gamble, as it could empower individuals who had no long-standing loyalty to the lord and could further erode the lord's direct control over their own lands. The consequences of such sales were rarely immediate, but they often laid the groundwork for future weakness and instability. As these desperate measures became more apparent, an inevitable and insidious process would begin: the loss of credibility. In the medieval world, a lord's reputation was as vital as their army. It was built on a perceived stability, a capacity to uphold their word, to provide protection, and to maintain the dignity of their station. As rumors of financial distress began to spread, whispers turning into open talk, a lord's creditworthiness would plummet. No longer would merchants be as willing to extend credit for goods. Other nobles might become hesitant to enter into alliances or marriage agreements, fearing they would be tied to a sinking ship. The ability to secure new loans would become increasingly difficult, as potential lenders, aware of the lord's mounting debts and dwindling assets, would view them as a high risk. This loss of trust was a crippling blow, severing the lord from the very networks of finance and influence that sustained their position. It was a vicious cycle. The more desperate the lord became, the more visible their financial distress, the less credible they appeared, making it even harder to escape the downward spiral. The shadow of debt, once a mere whisper, had now become a looming presence, threatening to consume everything. As the shadow of debt deepened and the desperate measures of a medieval lord proved insufficient, the quiet anxieties of private financial struggle would inevitably burst into the harsh light of public crisis. This was the moment when the legal and political machinery of the feudal world would engage, often with brutal efficiency, to strip away the lord's power, land, and indeed their very standing. This segment delves into the immediate, undeniable repercussions once a lord's financial woes became critically exposed, transforming personal ruin into a systemic dismantling of their authority. The most profound and devastating consequence of a lord's bankruptcy was the forfeiture and seizure of lands. In the medieval system, land was not merely property, it was the foundation of power, the source of income, and the symbol of lineage. To lose land was to lose everything. When a lord defaulted on their debts, creditors, or indeed the crown if the lord owed money to the king, had legal recourse to claim what was owed. The process could take various forms. A creditor might petition a court, or their own feudal overlord, to issue a writ allowing them to seize manors or castles that had been pledged as collateral. This was not a quick or easy process. It involved legal proceedings, often lengthy and complex, where the lord might attempt to dispute the debt or the terms of the agreement. However, if the evidence of default was clear, the legal system, designed to uphold property rights and contractual obligations, would generally side with the creditor. Imagine the chilling moment when the bailiffs, perhaps accompanied by armed men, arrived at the gates of a manor, proclaiming its forfeiture, demanding entry, and initiating the painful process of inventorying and transferring control. The quiet murmurs of the peasants, the stunned faces of the retainers, would underscore the gravity of the situation. In some cases, the lands might be transferred outright to the creditor, who would then assume all rights and responsibilities for the manor, including the collection of rents and the administration of justice. This meant a permanent loss of that part of the estate for the lord's family, a literal severing of their connection to the soil that had sustained them for generations. For particularly large debts, entire baronies or multiple manors could be claimed, fragmenting a once cohesive domain. Alternatively, lands might be placed under administration by a third party, often an agent appointed by the court or the crown, whose sole purpose was to manage the estate, collect its revenues, and apply them directly to the repayment of the lord's debts. This allowed the lord to theoretically retain nominal ownership, but they lost all practical control and income from the land until the debts were repaid. A repayment that, given the dire financial state, was often an insurmountable hurdle. The presence of an external administrator, overseeing the collection of taxes and demanding accounts, was a constant, humiliating reminder of the lord's failure, a public declaration of their inability to manage their own affairs. This was a profound social disgrace, a public declaration that the lord had failed in their essential duties. Imagine being stripped of the very name that defined your lineage, the title that your ancestors had proudly borne. It meant losing the right to sit in council, to participate in royal courts, to command respect, and to pass on your noble identity to your children. Hereditary offices, such as the High Constable of a region or the Royal Falconer, which often came with significant lands and incomes attached, could also be forfeited. This wasn't just about money. It was about the obliteration of identity, the erasure of centuries of family history and aspiration. The lord, once a pillar of society, would become a non-entity, a mere commoner, though perhaps one with a tragic, remembered past. In many instances, particularly when the debts were substantial or the lord's mismanagement threatened regional stability, the intervention by the crown or a superior overlord became almost inevitable. A king, as the ultimate feudal overlord, had a vested interest in the stability and order of their realm. The financial collapse of a powerful lord could create a dangerous vacuum of power, lead to lawlessness, or even spark wider conflicts if disgruntled vassals or opportunistic neighbors sought to exploit the weakness. The crown might intervene under various pretexts, to enforce justice, to protect the rights of creditors, or simply to assert their own authority. This intervention could take many forms. The king might directly seize the assets of the bankrupt lord, often claiming them for the royal treasury or distributing them to loyal supporters. This was a strategic opportunity for the crown to consolidate power, bringing once independent feudal holdings directly under royal control, or strengthening the hands of nobles who were more reliable and beholden to the king. A bankrupt lord's misfortune could thus become a king's gain, allowing the monarch to expand their direct influence and dismantle rival power bases. In extreme cases, a king might even imprison the bankrupt lord for debt or for perceived breaches of feudal loyalty. Medieval debtors' prisons were notoriously harsh, often dark, unsanitary, and overcrowded places. Such imprisonment was not just punitive, it was a means to exert pressure for repayment, to prevent the lord from causing further disorder, or to send a clear message to other nobles about the consequences of financial irresponsibility. The ignominy of a once proud lord languishing in a dungeon, stripped of their finery and comfort, was a stark warning to all who might follow a similar path. The financial collapse of a lord inevitably led to a profound weakening of feudal bonds, the intricate web of loyalties and obligations that characterized medieval society was based on a reciprocal relationship. A vassal swore homage and provided military service and counsel to their lord, but in return, the lord was expected to provide protection, administer justice, and maintain order. When a lord became bankrupt, their ability to uphold their end of this sacred contract withered. How could a lord provide protection if they couldn't afford to maintain a garrison, repair their castle walls, or field an army? How could they administer justice effectively if their local officials were bought off, or if their own authority was openly challenged? Vassals, discerning the lord's diminished capacity, might begin to withdraw their homage and service. This was not always an overt act of rebellion, but a gradual loosening of ties. They might delay payments, ignore summonses, or simply offer their loyalty to a more powerful and stable overlord. This created a perilous situation for the bankrupt lord, leaving them isolated, vulnerable, and without the very military and political support that defined their feudal existence. The sound of distant horns, once a call to arms for their loyal vassals, might now only echo hollowly, unanswered. Finally, for many, the ultimate consequence of overwhelming debt was the grim reality of debtors' prisons and exile. While a powerful lord might initially avoid the common prisons if their debts were to the crown, or if they became an embarrassment, imprisonment became a very real threat. As mentioned, these were not places of reform, but of containment and punishment. A lord, once accustomed to comfort and freedom, would face squalor, hunger, and disease, potentially for years, their release dependent on the repayment of debts that remained out of reach. The mental anguish of such an incarceration, the loss of dignity and hope, would have been immense. For others, particularly those who managed to escape imprisonment or whose crimes were more political than financial, forced exile became the only option. To be exiled meant to be stripped of one's lands, titles, and connections, cast out from the familiar world. A lord might flee to a distant court, seeking patronage from another ruler, or simply wander the continent as a disgraced figure, reliant on the charity of strangers. The contrast between their former life of power and their new existence as a penniless wanderer would have been a constant, bitter reminder of their spectacular fall. The legal and political fallout of bankruptcy was thus a merciless process, systematically dismantling every pillar of a medieval lord's authority, leaving them exposed and utterly bereft. As the legal and political structures closed in, stripping away a medieval lord's lands and authority, an equally devastating, though less tangible consequence would begin to unfold: the profound social humiliation and family disgrace. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval society, where status was inherited and honor was paramount, financial ruin was not merely an economic setback. It was a deep, festering wound to the very identity of a noble house. This segment explores the immense personal and familial shame that accompanied a lord's bankruptcy, a shame that could resonate for generations and permanently alter the course of a lineage. At the heart of this humiliation lay the devastating loss of honor and reputation. For a medieval lord, honor was the very currency of their existence. It encompassed their integrity, their military prowess, their generosity, their piety, and crucially, their ability to maintain their household and support their dependents. It was a carefully constructed edifice built over generations of ancestral deeds and present-day conduct. Financial ruin, however, could demolish this edifice in a single, ignominious collapse. To be bankrupt was to be publicly declared incapable, unreliable, and ultimately unworthy of the noble status. It suggested a failure in stewardship, a fundamental flaw in character that reflected poorly not just on the lord themselves, but on their entire lineage. Whispers would turn into open scorn. Other nobles might turn their backs, fearing association with such a disgraced figure. Vassals would lose respect, and even commoners, who had once looked up to their lord with a mixture of fear and admiration, might now view them with pity or contempt. Imagine the shame of being unable to host a proper feast, to provide for your retinue, or to contribute to a military campaign. These were visible markers of honor, and their absence was a glaring sign of failure. The lord, once admired and feared, would become an object of pity, or worse, ridicule. This loss of reputation was not merely uncomfortable, it was existentially threatening, undermining the very basis of their social standing and their ability to command respect and obedience. It was a silent, corrosive force, eating away at the lord's inner world, leaving behind a hollow shell where pride once resided. The impact of a lord's financial ruin extended far beyond their personal suffering, casting a long and heavy shadow over their children, particularly affecting their marriage prospects. In the medieval aristocratic world, marriage was less about romantic love and more about strategic alliances, solidifying power, acquiring new lands, and ensuring the continuation and advancement of the family line. The financial standing of a prospective spouse's family was a paramount consideration. For the children of a bankrupt lord, the doors to advantageous matches would slam shut. A daughter, once a coveted bride who could bring a substantial dowry and a powerful alliance, would now be seen as a burden. Families seeking to strengthen their own position would shy away, unwilling to tie their fortunes to a disgraced and impoverished house. The potential for a strategic marriage, which could have provided a lifeline to the family's fortunes, would vanish. Imagine a noble daughter, raised with expectations of a prestigious marriage, suddenly facing a future of limited options, perhaps relegated to a less desirable match with a minor gentry family, or even forced into a convent, not out of piety, but out of necessity. For sons, the situation was equally grim. While they might not bring a dowry, their marriage to a wealthy heiress or a daughter of a powerful house was often crucial for acquiring new lands, securing political influence, or rebuilding the family's lost wealth. A bankrupt lord's son would possess neither the lands nor the prestige to attract such a match. The opportunity to revitalize the family fortunes through strategic matrimony, a common avenue for recovery for some noble houses, would be foreclosed. The very lineage, the future of the noble house, was imperiled by the inability to form these crucial alliances, condemning future generations to a diminished, perhaps even commoner, existence. This brings us to one of the most tragic and final consequences of a lord's bankruptcy: the disruption of dynastic succession. For noble families, the continuation of their line, the unbroken chain of inheritance of land and title from father to son, was the ultimate measure of success and legacy. It was the very reason for their existence, the driving force behind their strategic choices and their lifelong efforts. Bankruptcy, however, could mean the absolute, irreversible end of a family's noble lineage. If all lands and titles were forfeited, if there were no assets left to inherit, then the very basis of their nobility ceased to exist. Imagine the weight of centuries of ancestry, of valiant knights and powerful counts, collapsing under the burden of one generation's financial ruin. The heirs, once destined for lives of privilege and power, would find themselves with no estates to manage, no vassals to command, and no titles to claim. They would, effectively, be forced into commoner status, indistinguishable from the very peasants their ancestors had ruled over. This was a profound existential threat, far worse than death in battle for many nobles. Death might bring glory or a martyr's crown. Financial ruin brought only ignominy and oblivion for the family name. The once proud crest, the ancestral hall, the very name that had resonated through generations, all would become empty symbols, relics of a past that was no more. The last living descendant, perhaps a landless and impoverished figure, would be the tragic end of a once great line, a quiet whisper in the annals of history, swallowed by the unforgiving currents of economic collapse. The personal and communal impact of such a downfall was immense. inflicting a severe psychological toll on the lord and their family. Imagine the weight of public scorn, the constant reminders of lost prestige, the gnawing anxiety of an uncertain future. A lord, once accustomed to deference and respect, would now face a world that saw them as a failure. The grand halls that once echoed with feasting and merriment would now stand silent, or be occupied by new, often less distinguished, masters. The very identity of the lord, so intrinsically linked to their land and status, would be shattered. For the lord, this could manifest as deep depression, despair, or even a descent into madness. For their family, particularly their spouse and children, who had been raised in luxury and privilege, the shock and sudden destitution would be equally traumatic. They would confront the stark realities of poverty, the loss of social networks, and the grim prospects for their future. The psychological burden of watching their world collapse, of seeing centuries of family endeavor reduced to nothing, was an immense and often silent suffering, a gnawing torment that paralleled the public disgrace. The contrast between what they were and what they had become was a constant source of pain, a scar that time could never fully erase. And finally, the fall of a once powerful noble family often contributed to a subtle but significant changing social landscape. While tragic for the individuals involved, the collapse of one noble house created opportunities for others. Often, it was the gentry, families of lesser nobility or wealthy commoners who had accumulated wealth through trade, legal professions, or efficient agricultural management, who would step in to acquire the lands and titles of the bankrupt lord. They would purchase the forfeited manors, perhaps even securing the vacated titles through royal favor, slowly climbing the social ladder. Similarly, wealthy merchants, with their growing liquid capital, were often eager to invest in land, which conferred prestige and political influence. They might buy up scattered properties, building new estates, and eventually establishing their own noble lineages. This process, repeated across medieval Europe, subtly but profoundly shifted the social hierarchy. It showed that while birthright was powerful, it was not immutable. Financial acumen, adaptability, and even sheer luck could allow new families to rise, creating a more dynamic, albeit still stratified, social order. The quiet desolation of a fallen house often became the fertile ground for the aspirations of a rising one, gradually reshaping the tapestry of medieval society, one bankruptcy at a time. While the fall of a medieval lord was a personal and familial tragedy, its repercussions were never confined to the castle walls. The intricate web of medieval society meant that the lord's financial collapse sent profound ripple effects throughout their domain, directly impacting the lives of the countless peasants, serfs, and other inhabitants who toiled on their lands. Their daily routines, their meager livelihoods, and their sense of security were intrinsically tied to the stability of their lord. When that stability fractured, their world could easily shatter too. This segment will explore how a lord's bankruptcy trickled down, transforming the lives of those furthest removed from the noble court. Perhaps the most immediate and often brutal consequence for the common people was the increased exploitation by new lords or creditors. When a manor or an entire estate was seized due to debt, it often fell into the hands of a new master. This might be a wealthy creditor, a powerful merchant, or even another noble who had acquired the land from the king or through purchase. These new owners or their agents often had a singular objective: to quickly recoup their investment or satisfy the outstanding debts. This rarely boded well for the existing tenants. The new lord or their representative might impose harsher taxes, demanding more coin or more produce than the previous lord. Rents, which had perhaps remained stable for generations under the old lord, could be significantly increased, straining the already precarious finances of peasant families. Increased fines for minor infractions or for using common resources, like the Lord's mill or oven, could be arbitrarily levied, designed not for justice, but for revenue generation. Furthermore, demands for more labor service from the serfs could become oppressive. Peasants might find themselves spending an even greater portion of their week working the new lord's domain lands, repairing roads, or performing other arduous tasks, leaving less time to cultivate their own small plots. The rhythm of their lives, once dictated by the seasons and traditional obligations, would now be governed by the urgent need of the new master to extract maximum profit. The familiar, if sometimes burdensome, routine of life under the old lord would be replaced by an unknown, often more demanding regime. Imagine the quiet despair in the village as new, unfamiliar faces arrived, bearing warrants and demanding heavier burdens, signaling an end to the established order and the start of a period of relentless extraction. The financial collapse of a lord, particularly if it led to a vacuum of power, could also usher in a period of terrifying instability and lawlessness. A lord was not just a landowner. They were the primary administrator of justice, the enforcer of order, and the protector of their lands. When this figure was weakened, absent, or discredited, the very fabric of local society could begin to fray. Without a strong lord to uphold the law, increased banditry often became a grim reality. Roaming gangs of disillusioned soldiers, desperate peasants, or opportunistic criminals would prey on vulnerable travelers, isolated farmsteads, and even entire villages. The quiet fear of an approaching rider, the rustle in the woods at night, would grow as the certainty of the Lord's justice waned. Intermanorial disputes, once resolved by the arbitration of the Lord, could escalate into violent skirmishes between neighboring villages or petty nobles, each seeking to expand their territory or seize resources in the absence of a central authority. Fields might be raided, livestock stolen, and lives endangered, with little recourse for the common people caught in the crossfire. In extreme cases, if conditions became unbearable due to the new demands from aggressive creditors or rapacious new lords, peasant revolts could erupt. Driven by desperation, hunger, and a profound sense of injustice, peasants might rise up against their oppressors, burning manor houses, attacking officials, and demanding a return to older, fairer customs. While often brutally suppressed, these revolts underscored the fragility of the social order when the lord-peasant relationship broke down, demonstrating the profound suffering that could push ordinary people to extraordinary acts. The air itself seemed to hum with an unsettling tension, the quiet hum of daily life replaced by the uneasy silence of uncertainty and fear. Peasants would flee their homes in search of better conditions, perhaps on the lands of a more benevolent lord, in a burgeoning town that offered greater freedoms, or simply in an area untouched by the current instability. They would leave behind their ancestral homes, their small plots of land, and the familiar rhythm of their lives, embarking on a perilous journey into the unknown. Imagine the quiet, desperate preparations, gathering a few meager possessions, bundling children, and stealing away in the dead of night, hoping to escape the misery. This flight, though a personal act of survival, collectively led to the depopulation of the former lord's estates. Fields that had once teemed with life would lie fallow and overgrown. Cottages would stand empty and derelict. Villages, once vibrant communities, would become ghost towns, their populations scattered to the winds. For the new lord or creditor, this exodus presented a new problem. Land without labourers was largely worthless, further highlighting the interconnectedness of lord and peasant, even in ruin. The quiet paths through the fields, once trodden daily by many feet, would slowly become choked with weeds, marking the quiet, poignant desolation of lost communities. Beyond the immediate hardships, the advent of a new lord, or the intervention of external creditors often brought about significant changes in governance and custom. Each lord, while bound by broader regional laws, often had their own local customs, traditions, and ways of managing their estates. Long-established routines, inherited from generations past, provided a sense of predictability and security for the peasants. A new lord, however, might introduce entirely different customs, laws, or management styles. They might have different interpretations of traditional rights, or they might simply disregard them in their pursuit of maximum revenue. Ancient agreements regarding common lands, rights to timber from the forest, or the use of mills could be revoked or altered. Legal protections, once implicitly understood through custom, could be eroded or ignored. The new master might impose different forms of justice, harsher penalties, or a more rigorous system of collection. This disruption to long-established ways of life created immense uncertainty and resentment among the populace. The familiar rhythm of their lives, the comfort of knowing what to expect, would be shattered. Peasants who relied on these established customs for their very survival would feel adrift, their traditional ways of life under threat from an alien and often unsympathetic authority. The quiet murmur of discontent would begin to rise, a low hum of anxiety about the changing world around them. Finally, a bankrupt lord's failure often translated directly into a profound loss of protection and justice for their subjects. A fundamental aspect of the feudal contract was the lord's obligation to protect their lands and people from external threats. When a lord was financially crippled, this ability evaporated. They might be unable or unwilling to defend their lands from external threats. Neighboring lords, seeing an opportunity in weakness, might launch raids, seizing livestock or even entire villages with impunity. Bandit gangs, as previously noted, would operate freely. Without a strong hand to maintain a garrison or field a defensive force, the peasants were left vulnerable and exposed, their lives and property at the mercy of any who chose to take them. The silent anxieties of the approaching winter, of potential famine, would now be joined by the very real fear of armed intrusion, of violence from without. Similarly, a bankrupt lord might be unable or unwilling to provide consistent justice. The lord's court was the primary means for resolving disputes, punishing criminals, and upholding local order. If the lord's authority was diminished, if their officials were corrupt, or if they simply lacked the resources to maintain a functioning judicial system, the peasants would be left without recourse. Disputes might fester, crimes might go unpunished, and the very concept of justice would break down. Imagine a peasant whose crops were stolen, or whose daughter was wronged, with no one to appeal to, no court to hear their plea. They would be left exposed, vulnerable, and without the fundamental protections that a stable feudal system was supposed to offer. The quiet despair of lawlessness, the slow realization that there was no one to turn to, would settle over the land, a bitter legacy of the lord's ruin. As the echoes of financial collapse reverberated through the castle and across the fields, a medieval lord, stripped of land, title, and honor, would stand at a critical juncture. For some, a glimmer of hope, a desperate avenue for recovery, might present itself, though often at a profound personal or familial cost. For many others, however, the descent into ruin would prove irreversible, leading to the ultimate erasure of their noble lineage. This concluding segment explores these divergent paths, examining the often limited opportunities for a bankrupt lord to reclaim their fortune, or the bitter end that awaited those for whom all hope was lost. One of the most potent, albeit often personally unappealing avenues for a bankrupt noble family to claw their way back from destitution was through strategic marriage alliances. With their own lands gone and their prestige diminished, a direct male heir, or a marriageable daughter became a crucial, perhaps the only, remaining asset. Such an alliance would rarely be one of mutual aristocratic prestige. Instead, it would involve a pragmatic, often stark exchange. The goal would be to marry into a wealthy family, typically one of the rising merchant class or a newly empowered gentry house. These families, while possessing vast liquid capital, often lack the ancient lineage and social standing that the fallen noble family, despite its current penury, still technically possessed. The bankrupt lord, or their remaining family, could offer the invaluable prestige of an ancient name, a connection to a historically significant lineage, in exchange for the wealth and resources needed to rebuild. Imagine the quiet negotiations, the painful compromise of pride, as a once proud noble family offered their child's hand to a merchant, whose ancestors might have been common tradesmen, but whose coffers now overflowed with coin. Such a marriage, particularly for an heir or a daughter, could provide a crucial lifeline. The dowry brought by a wealthy bride, or the financial support provided by a rich merchant father-in-law, could inject new capital into the family. This newfound wealth could then be used to buy back lost land, perhaps even properties from their original ancestral estates that had been seized by creditors. It was a slow, arduous process, often taking generations to fully restore the family's former glory, but it was a tangible path to redemption. The lands once alienated could slowly be reacquired, piece by painful piece, rebuilding the territorial base that was the foundation of their power. This process exemplified the fluidity, albeit slow, of medieval society, where wealth could sometimes trump ancient lineage, and a tarnished name could find new luster through strategic acquisition. Beyond the intimate world of family alliances, another potential, though often equally desperate, path for a bankrupt lord was to seek royal favor and service. The king, as the ultimate authority, had the power to grant new lands, bestow titles, and appoint individuals to lucrative positions within the royal administration or military. A lord who had lost everything might throw themselves upon the king's mercy, offering their sword, their strategic knowledge, or their remaining connections in the hope of a royal reprieve. This often meant demonstrating unwavering loyal military service. A bankrupt lord, no longer able to raise their own forces, might serve directly in the king's army, fighting in distant campaigns, enduring hardships, and proving their worth on the battlefield. Success in war could lead to a grant of new lands in conquered territories, a pension, or a position within a royal garrison. Administrative duties within the royal court or local governance could also be a pathway. A lord, even a disgraced one, might still possess valuable experience in managing estates, administering justice, or negotiating with other nobles. If they proved themselves competent and utterly loyal to the crown, the king might grant them an office with a salary or even a temporary administrative role over a royal manor, providing a steady income and a chance to rebuild a reputation. For some, the ultimate gamble was participation in crusades. These religious wars, while fraught with peril, offered a unique opportunity for both spiritual redemption and worldly gain. A bankrupt lord might join a crusade, hoping for a grant of land in the Holy Land, the acquisition of plunder, or simply to die a glorious death, erasing the shame of their financial ruin in the eyes of God and man. Even if they returned empty-handed, the act of crusading itself could restore a measure of honor and moral standing in a deeply religious age, perhaps opening doors to patronage or a more favorable reception at court. The rhythmic chants of pilgrims, the quiet determination of men marching towards a distant horizon, offered a grim hope for redemption, a chance to cleanse not just their souls, but their tarnished names. For those who found no such opportunities, or for whom the shame and destitution became unbearable, a very different path beckoned: religious life as a retreat. For some, Entering a monastery or convent represented a complete relinquishment of earthly claims and worldly concerns. It was a profound act of resignation, a turning away from the secular world that had betrayed them. A bankrupt lord, or a daughter whose marriage prospects had vanished, might seek solace and sustenance within the cloistered walls of a religious order. They would take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, exchanging their noble raiment for a simple habit. While this meant abandoning all hopes of recovering their wealth or status, it offered a sanctuary, a secure place to live, and the spiritual comfort of a life dedicated to God. It was a way to escape the public scorn, the constant struggle, and the gnawing anxieties of their former existence. For some, it might even be seen as a way to redeem the family's honor, dedicating their remaining years to piety and prayer, perhaps with the hope that their spiritual devotion might in some way atone for the family's earthly failings. The quiet hum of monastic chants, the measured rhythm of prayer and contemplation, offered a profound contrast to the chaos of their former lives, a final, peaceful surrender to a higher power. However, for many, particularly those without strong royal connections, access to new wealth, or the inclination for religious life, bankruptcy meant an absolute and irreversible descent into poverty and the loss of lineage. There were no lifelines, no strategic marriages, no royal favours to be had. Their fall was final. Such individuals might find themselves utterly destitute, reduced to the ranks of common labourers, struggling to survive day by day. A lord who once commanded armies might now toil in the fields, their hands calloused, their noble bearing a forgotten memory. Their descendants, without any inheritance of land or title, would become indistinguishable from the peasantry, their noble blood diluted by generations of common marriages. The once proud family name, if it survived at all, would become a distant, almost forgotten whisper, a fragment of history to be found only in dusty parish registers or the forgotten charters of old. The loss of lineage was the ultimate tragedy. The uninterrupted chain of family history, carefully recorded and proudly recited for centuries, would simply break. There would be no more lords of that name, no more lands under their dominion. The family, once a vibrant thread in the tapestry of medieval society, would simply cease to exist as a noble entity, dissolving into the anonymous mass of common people. The quiet finality of this outcome, the silent vanishing of a once prominent name, underscored the brutal realities of a world where status was precarious and financial ruin could mean existential oblivion. Yet these individual tragedies and triumphs, these quiet vanishings and subtle resurrections, collectively shaped the long-term historical impact of medieval financial collapses. The fall of certain noble houses, often due to their inability to manage their finances, created vacancies in the power structure. These vacancies were swiftly filled by others, ambitious gentry, wealthy merchants, or loyal royal servants who were granted the forfeited lands and titles. This continuous process of old noble families, failing and new ones rising in their place, gradually shaped the political and social landscape of medieval Europe over centuries. It contributed to the ongoing shift in power dynamics, weakening the fragmented power of independent feudal lords, and often strengthening the centralized authority of the crown. The crown, by acquiring forfeited lands and granting them to loyalists, could consolidate its control, creating a more unified and stable realm. The silent rise of the merchant class, often enabled by their ability to purchase bankrupt estates, slowly but surely altered the social hierarchy, injecting new blood and new economic forces into the aristocratic world. The quiet desperation of a bankrupt lord, the slow, agonizing process of their fall, was thus not merely a personal story, but a fundamental, if subtle, engine of historical change, constantly reshaping the intricate and ever-evolving tapestry of medieval society. As our journey through the quiet corridors of medieval financial ruin draws to a close, we can now appreciate the profound and far-reaching consequences of a lord's bankruptcy. We have seen how the relentless demands of warfare, the pressures of ostentatious living, and the precariousness of an agriculturally dependent economy could slowly erode even the grandest fortunes. We have traced the desperate measures taken, the insidious creep of debt, and the inexorable stripping away of land, title, and honor through legal and political forces. But perhaps most poignantly, we have observed the quiet, yet devastating, ripple effects that cascaded down to the common people, reshaping their daily lives, often with increased hardship and instability. And finally, we have seen the ultimate divergent paths, a desperate, often humiliating, struggle for recovery through strategic alliances or royal favor, or the final, silent descent into anonymity, the permanent erasure of a once proud noble lineage. The story of the bankrupt lord is a testament to the fragility of power, even in a seemingly immutable feudal system. It reminds us that wealth, honor, and influence were not guaranteed, but constantly had to be earned, maintained, and fiercely defended against the twin threats of natural calamity and financial misstep. The fall of a lord was not just a personal tragedy. It was a societal earthquake, reshaping communities, altering power dynamics, and subtly, but fundamentally, redirecting the course of history. Now, as the echoes of these historical currents fade and the medieval world recedes into the gentle mists of the past, allow yourself to drift. The anxieties of old, the struggles of power and possession, now belong to the annals of history. You are here now, in the quiet comfort of your own space. Let the lingering thoughts of distant castles and forgotten debts dissolve into the stillness of the night. The stories are told, the lessons learned, and the rest is silence. Sleep now, and may your dreams be peaceful.